Hello everybody and welcome to the 13th video in our series of videos on political developments in Ireland in the 20th century. We were looking at the War of Independence and the truce that was called in July of 1921, and today we're going to look at the negotiations that took place after this truce was called. As always, we begin with our learning outcomes, so by the end of this presentation you guys should know three main issues up for discussion during the treaty negotiations. You guys should know three main provisions of the Anglo Irish Treaty, and then you guys should know two arguments for and two arguments against the treaty. So between July and October of 1921, Eamon de Valera and David Lloyd George, here on the right, the Prime Minister of Britain, they met 4 times in private, but they failed to agree on anything. So De Valera selected a delegation to represent Ireland in negotiations. These included Arthur Griffith, Michael Collins, Robert Barton, Eamon Duggan and George Gavin Duffy. Arthur Griffith was the head of the delegation, and Michael Collins was second in command. They were negotiating with a vastly more experienced British politicians. David Lloyd George, the Prime Minister, as we mentioned, he was known as the Welsh Wizard. He had run rings around Woodrow Wilson in the Paris peace negotiations. Winston Churchill, who I'm sure most of you know, Austen Chamberlain and Lord Birkenhead were also part of that British delegation. De Valera had refused to go as he was head of the state, and he gave the delegation orders that they would have to consult him and the Dáil before coming to any agreements. So there were 3 main issues up for discussion. Security or the treaty ports, the partition of Ireland and Ireland's association with Britain. So on the first point, all sides agreed that for security purposes that Britain would have control of 3 ports in Ireland. These were Lough Swilly, Cove or Spike Island and Bearhaven. Partition was the next main issue, but it wasn't as big an issue as was later made out to be. At the time, all the politicians in the Dáil were mainly concerned with Ireland's status in relation to Britain. Now, partition had come into effect in Ireland before the negotiations in 1920, when Westminster passed the Government of Ireland. This was based off the Third Home Rule Bill that was meant to come into effect in 1914, but was delayed by World War I. It set up a separate parliament in Northern Ireland, which was defined as the 6 counties of Antrim, Down, Armagh, Derry, Tyrone and Fermanagh. Both sides, the Irish and English, agreed to the setting up of a boundary commission in the future that would decide on the border between Northern and Southern Ireland. The Irish believed that the border would be withdrawn significantly, in line with the amount of Catholics and nationalists who were in Northern Ireland. So this wasn't a massive point of contention once they had the promise of a boundary commission. The big sticking point in negotiations was the status Ireland would have. All sides knew that a republic wouldn't be granted. Even though that was the aim of Sinn Féin and the Volunteers, they knew a republic wouldn't be granted. Britain had wanted Ireland to become a member of the British Commonwealth, like Canada and Australia, like you can see here, the Commonwealth in Britain in the 1920s, they had a lot of independence, but they still recognised the king as the head of the estate. So I suppose the way the Commonwealth would look was it would have king as the head of state, and Ireland would be within this thing called the Commonwealth. De Valera wanted something called external association, where Ireland would be outside of the Commonwealth. As you can kind of see here, Commonwealth and Ireland are side by side as 2 separate sovereign nations. And instead of the king being the head of state, the king would be the head of the association. So this is what De Valera wanted, and this is what the British wanted. On the 6th of December, David Lloyd George gave the Irish delegation assurances about Irish unity, about the Boundary Commission, and that Ireland would have a special dominion status and be known as a free state, the Free State of Ireland. He also told them that if they didn't sign there and then, that there would be immediate war. Collins, in particular, was aware that Ireland was not prepared to go back to immediate war. So Once Griffith had agreed to sign, Collins followed quickly, and then they convinced the other delegates to sign. So the main points of the treaty, the first four are in relation to Ireland's association with Britain. The next one is about security, and the final one is about the partition. So the first thing was Ireland would be known as a free state, the Free State of Ireland. Ireland would be in the Commonwealth. The king would have a representative known as the Governor General in the country. All the members of the Dáil would have to take an oath of allegiance to the king as the head of the state. The fifth point was that Britain would have the treaty ports, which would be the three treaty ports that we talked about earlier on. And finally, a boundary commission would be set up to decide on the border issue with Northern Ireland. The delegates returned home with the treaty, and it was rapidly debated between December 1921 and January 1922. The Dáil broke into two camps. We had the pro-treaty camp and the anti-treaty camp. So Collins and Griffith were the leaders of the pro-treaty camp, while Cathal Brugha and Eamon de Valera were two of the leaders of the anti-treaty camp. So the pro-treaty camp said that the IRA, we had to accept the treaty because the IRA couldn't continue the war. Collins called it a stepping stone to Irish independence, that it gave Ireland the freedom to achieve freedom. And the final point they said was that it gave way more independence than Home Rule had ever promised to give Ireland. The anti-treaty people many of them wanted to arrest the delegation when they arrived back in Ireland as traders, because they believed that better terms could have been negotiated, and they were really unhappy that the king was recognised as head of the state. So all these people who had died, and still we would have to swear an oath of allegiance to the king, was something that they found unacceptable. The final vote on whether to accept the treaty took place on the 7th of January 1922, and the pro-treaty side won 64 to 57. As you can see, this was massive international news. This is the front page of the New York Times. And De Valera resigned, and he and his supporters left the Dáil, and Arthur Griffith replaced De Valera as President of Ireland. This was going to be one of the main factors in civil war breaking out in Ireland in 1922. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. So by now you guys should know the three main issues up for discussion during the treaty negotiations, mainly security, partition, and Ireland's association with Britain. You should know three main provisions of the Anglo Irish Treaty, so that it was a free state, that it was inside the Commonwealth, the treaty ports, the boundary commission, the oath of allegiance, and the Governor General. And finally, you guys should know two arguments for and two arguments against the treaty. So arguments for, that the IRA couldn't continue the war, it gave Ireland freedom to achieve freedom, and it gave Ireland more independence than Home Rule. And arguments against, that the better terms could have been negotiated, and that they weren't happy that the king was recognised as head of state. That's the end of the presentation. Hope you guys got something useful from it.